So I don't know if you've all seen the exhibition yet. The exhibition the intention was to give a little bit of a context to Stanley's work, and we've taken a number of loans from Southampton City Art Gallery. And there were a number of reasons why we chose that museum. Some of them were practical. Our registrar at the gallery works as a curator there, so it's very nice to have that sort of segue into the collection. And also for our museum, it's brilliant to have a breadth of works coming in, sort of lots of different items, but for them to be able to come from one place is an awful lot easier for us, from cost and just sort of processing the conservation reports and things. You know, we have to be very mindful of that sort of thing. So that was another plus. Obviously, Southampton has an extraordinary collection of modern British art. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But obviously, one of the highlights is the raising of Jairus's daughter, which I think is one of the real highlights of the show. And lastly, I'm a great fan of Southampton City, partly because of the way in which it was established. It was built on a true Victorian philanthropic model. And our museum, obviously, the cornerstone of which is philanthropy. We all give our time to keep it going. And so there's a really nice symbiosis there, if you like. And I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about Southampton and the beginnings of the museum. Because I think, as I'm sure you're aware, history of collecting is one of my great passions. And I think it's very interesting to learn about how collections were formed and why. And so this is the Southampton City Gallery in the 1920s, when it was based in the Central Library. And this is the gallery as it came to be in 1939, when it was opened. So quite a transformation there. So I'm just going to go back to that. So by the late 1870s, there was a huge surge in Victorian provincial collections and art galleries. So Manchester City in 1823, Leicester in 1849, Leeds in 1876. And there was this huge surge of Victorian philanthropists who made a lot of money, who wanted to give back. They were hugely civic-minded. They had a great interest in art. And I only wish the tech billionaires have now had the same outlook, but sadly not. And a big part of that was education. They wanted to educate the poor. And so this was a really impressive philanthropic model. So the early seeds of Southampton City were sown by a very early bequest called the Hartley bequest, and it started off in a townhouse with a little education centre on the side. But the change came when this chap, Robert Chipperfield, left a bequest. And he really left a huge amount of money to create an actual museum along with an educational centre. And he might look like a bit of a stiff old Victorian gentleman, but he was incredibly avant-garde for his time. He died in 1911. He was a councillor of Southampton City, but he made his money as a pharmacist. And he gave his collection of 183 works to the city. They were all very 19th century, very Victorian taste. But the key to his legacy was the massive amount of money he left for the building project, which was around £9 million in today's money. And he was really the bedrock from which the museum flourished. He was incredibly important. And there were two conditions to his legacy, one of which was that the museum should be free to enter, very much like the National Gallery in London. And the second was that any new acquisitions from using his fund should be overseen by the director of the National Gallery, which was a hugely enlightened concept. And we're going to look a little bit more at how that works a little bit later on. So following his bequest, someone called Ernest Barry Webber was commissioned to build the gallery. And as you can see, it is the most beautiful space. And it has since undergone a few renovations. You know, museums changed their function a bit, and the way visitors attend museums are very different now. But this is how it was conceived when it was opened in 1939. It was opened by the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. It's now a Grade 2 star-listed building. And you can see these beautiful airy vaults, almost like a Roman basilica or an Italian Renaissance church. I mean, it slightly reminds me of the National Gallery Sainsbury wing in some ways. And we'll see a bit later how that architecture came to connect with the initial concept of how the collection was formed. The collection was to be a sort of an arc of Western art history, and this chimed beautifully with the architecture, this lovely pared back stone. So we're going to skip on to the next very boring looking Victorian gentleman who was equally important. So if you think Chipperfield died in 1911, this guy, Frederick William Smith, died in 1925. He was also a councillor, made his money as a timber merchant, and he sat on the bequest committee for Robert Chipperfield's legacy, and he was inspired by that. And as such, he then was inspired to give his own legacy. And this is to quote him, he said, "My estate shall be forever devoted to the promotion of education in the art of painting and the public opportunity of seeing good pictures." How I wish things were that simple now. I mean, it would make life a lot easier in the current climate. And he gave a massive acquisitions fund for the gallery. And again, I'm going to quote him because I think it's very funny. He wrote, "I hope that freaks will not be purchased, but this does not mean that new ideas should be avoided." So there was this wonderful sort of aesthetic balance between trying to be a little bit avant-garde and choose new things, but do it with a sort of informed and educated choice. And as chance would have it, Southampton was advised by a succession of exceptional art historians, and the first of which was Sir Robert Witt. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he was part of the early Courtauld collection, the Courtauld Gallery, and was an incredibly important connoisseur and aesthete, and really helped to form the early discipline of art history in Britain. And he was also a National Gallery trustee and a great collector in his own right. So he was a brilliant starter advisor to the museum. So initially, as we've seen, we've got this collection from Chipperfield, which was very Victorian, a lot of portraits, very British, and mostly very little pre-1700. So it took a huge amount of time to resolve some of the issues in Chipperfield's will. And thereafter, so that was around 1930, the NG stepped in, the National Gallery director stepped in and began advising. And this is when really the fortunes of the gallery changed. This was the man who changed everything, Sir Kenneth Clarke. He became director in 1934 at the age of 30. I must say, I have a massive intellectual crush on Kenneth Clarke. I think he was an extraordinary man, and for my sake, we're going to just think about the way he changed art history in Britain just for a little bit. So I just want to give you one of his quotes, which I think tells you a lot about what he thought art was. So he said, "Art is a long word which stretches from millinery to religion." And so that, for me, really expresses how art can encompass a huge variety of disciplines. And as such, the pictures he chose for Southampton were very broad in their outlook, and also in his own collection. I just wanted to show this very amusing letter, which actually predated Kenneth Clarke, because there was this little bit of friction between the councillors of Southampton City and the National Gallery advisors. And I had a similar thing working at the National Trust. So, and as an advisor, I would say, you know, you've got to buy this, that, and the other. And all the people working in the houses thought this was absolute rubbish, and they should buy what they wanted to. So you had the same thing going on at Southampton, and you can see that this town clerk here has gone to the RA summer exhibition and found all these wonderful pictures that he thought the gallery would love. And Augustus Daniel, then the director of the National Gallery, has literally crossed through most of them, leaving 2, which he thought were a sort of reasonable quality for the museum. So there was forever a little bit of friction, but good old KC, as he came to be known, sort of did away with all the councillors and instead hired a succession, well, 2 exceptional curators. So this really kick-started the new era at Southampton. Just very quickly about Kenneth Clark. So his approach was influenced by 2 people who were really important in the establishment of the discipline of art history in the 1920s and 30s. First of all was Roger Fry, who we know quite a bit about. He was very important to Stanley Spencer. He lectured Stanley at the Slade on Old Master paintings, and really, I think, really powered Stanley's interest in Giotto and the Italian primitives. And Kenneth Clark met Roger Fry a little bit later in 1923 when he was lecturing at Oxford. And Kenneth Clark found him spellbinding. And Fry, I would argue, was a tastemaker as much as Kenneth Clark. And Fry always argued about pure aesthetic sensations, and obviously Kenneth Clark was very much, his choices were very much powered by a similar thought process. The other person who was very important to Kenneth Clark's choices was A.B. Warburg, who came over. He was from that sort of slew of German art historians who came over just before the war. And he set up the Warburg Institute in London, and again was a key figure in establishing the discipline of art history in London. And Warburg was interesting because he saw art as a cultural object. It was all about origin, meaning, and transmission. It was putting it into a large context in a very broad setting. And again, that really defined Kenneth Clark's outlook. So as such, informed by Warburg and Fry, you know, the very prodigious Kenneth Clark really transformed the fortunes of the museum. And his ambition, you know, as director of the National Gallery, obviously you are in charge of one of the most important art institutions in the world, and he could have been very insular about that, but he wanted to change the way the nation looked at art. He wanted to extend it beyond those who were educated. He wanted to extend it to the provinces. And that was, he continued to do that through the Second World War, as we'll see. So it was extending art to the provinces, creating a meaningful narrative of Western art history, which would be quite unpopular now, but that's what he did. And he was quite clever because he bought pictures that, like this one, Burne-Jones, the Perseus and Andromeda series, that in those days were really unpopular. So he tended to buy things sort of the second rung. So he wasn't buying Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo. He was buying the next rung down. And so they were financially incredibly astute, but they were exceptional works. They were aesthetically outstanding. So that was his modus operandi. And I just wanted to very quickly go through. So there's Kenneth Clark at Saltram, Saltwood Castle. So he had a house in London and this house in Kent, which I went to some years ago. There was a huge sale of his works after he died, but some of which remain there. And I met there Alan Clark, his son's long-suffering wife, Jane, who is an extraordinary lady. And it is the most magical house. And there are still some of his works there, including Stanley's lilacs, which I was not able to take a photograph of because that's not correct form, so I'm not allowed to show it. But I think it's really indicative of Stanley's status amongst modern British artists that Kenneth Clark should have hung that picture and retained it in his own house. There's a certain amount of correspondence between him and Stanley, and also Stanley trying to help his brother Gilbert, recommending him to Kenneth Clark and trying to assist Gilbert's ascent in the art world. And Kenneth Clark, he was not into abstraction. He bought one painting by Ben Nicholson, one of the white ones with the sort of white circles within it, but clearly didn't like it. And his thing really was works of art that were based in the natural world, but had some sort of freedom of expression. So I think Stanley wasn't quite his taste, but he liked him enough to own something by him, and also, as we'll see, employ him during the Second World War when he chaired the War Artists Advisory Committee. So I just wanted to show a few examples of Kenneth Clark's collection, because I find his collection really fascinating. And this is now in Tate. It's by David de Grange, and it's a very early picture, and it's of the Saltonstall family. And here you've got Richard Saltonstall with his with his daughter and his little boy, who is still then wearing skirts, as they did until the age of 7. And his first wife is dead. She's lying in bed, and you can see from her slightly pallid expression that she is no longer with us. And then to the right, we've got his second wife with holding their new baby. And again, at that time, this sort of thing was really unpopular, but now we see it as an incredibly important part of sort of portraiture at that date. He was also interested in statuary and enamel work, and obviously this was one of his most famous works, which is a Renoir La Baigneuse, which we'll come on to Mark Gertler. Mark Gertler saw this in his house and absolutely hated it. He couldn't bear the saccharine nature of the paint and the subject. But this is now in Turin, sadly. I just wanted to touch on this because this is a passion of mine as well. So this is where Kenneth Clark went wrong. And these panels are in the National Gallery, and he bought them, he thought rather cleverly, as by Giorgione, the very famous 16th century artist. And within 6 months, another German art historian had come along and written a huge article in the scholarly Burlington magazine saying, these are certainly not by Giorgione, these are by someone else called Previtali. And there was this huge hoo-ha. It went to Parliament, there were letters to the Times, and actually Previtali is the attribution that has stuck. But this was a pretty desperate moment in his career, and he nearly lost his job. So Kenneth Clark was not infallible, sadly, but I still think he was one of the best. So back to the exhibition after that little Kenneth Clark moment. I don't know if many of you saw the exhibition called Counterpoint, where we took some loans from the Ingram collection of modern British art. And we divided the exhibition up into various sections, some of which we have mirrored in this exhibition too, because actually they make a lot of sense. So the first section is on the Slade, and this extraordinary cohort of artists who studied there with Stanley from 1908. So here we've got Dora Carrington, Nevinson, there's Gertler, and there's Stanley, and this whole range of women artists who have since been forgotten, which I think is something that is now being rectified by art historians today. They were too busy looking after their artist husbands to be able to carry on. So it's really nice in the exhibition to have this, this painting by Mark Gertler, which I really think is one of the highlights of the show. And it was bought by Southampton in 1954, not by Kenneth Clark, but by the subsequent director of the National Gallery, Philip Hendy. This was painted in 1913. And Gertler, I mean, I'm sure you've sort of read all the labels and the catalogue and everything, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but Gertler was such a prodigy. He came from a very poor family, lived in the East End in Whitechapel, and he was supported at the Slade by the Jewish Educational Aid Society. And I think this picture is spellbinding, and I love having these two pictures either side of that door, the Gertler and the Bomberg. He and Spencer never really got on. I think you'll remember he fell out with him because they were talking about Cézanne and they didn't agree with each other. But I think Gertler had this extraordinary, very singular artistic talent, and this really is an homage to his Jewish ancestry. And there are a few interesting things about this picture. Firstly, the two sitters never met. We don't know who the rabbi is. We don't have a name for him. But the girl on the right was the butcher's daughter, called Dora Plakowski. And Gertler saw her one day in the queue at the butcher's and asked her to sit to him. And he gave her a bit of pocket money, never spoke to her, ever. And she soon got bored and stopped the sittings. And then Gertler had a little bit of a crisis and couldn't resolve the picture. And it originally came down to his knees, and she was sitting on his knee, which I think was not an ideal resolution. So he went off to Brighton and had a great time, and he wrote these letters to Dora Carrington, on whom he had a massive sort of infatuation, very much in the manner of Stanley and Patricia. And he came back and he wrote, God, these girls were amazing. I had such a great time. The beach was good. And now I have resolved this picture. And he cut it and left it as it is now. What does it mean? I mean, it's obviously about his Jewish ancestry, but he was also really interested in Northern Renaissance painting. We know that he went to a lot of lectures about that subject. And I think it's in that northern tradition of artists like Cranach who show old and young people, and it's like this sort of aesthetic contrast, the contrast between wisdom and innocence. And so I think there's definitely something of that going on. So this is the Bomberg, the interior of the Armenian church, painted in 1925. So obviously this is post-war, and I was in two minds whether to put it in the Slade section or afterwards. And Bomberg was such an important part of that Slade crisis of brilliance. I thought it was important to envelop him in that section. He also was Jewish. He was originally taught by Sickert at Westminster Art School, and then went on to the Slade in 1911, also aided by the Jewish Educational Aid Society. Henry Tonks, who taught this amazing group, he taught Stanley draftsmanship, absolutely hated Bomberg. Bomberg saw the Futurist exhibition in 1912 and went off on a bit of a tangent, and Tonks couldn't stand this. It was far too free, and there was no emphasis on drawing. And ultimately his sponsorship was withdrawn, so he left. He went off to war. He enlisted with the Royal Engineers and the King's Royal Rifles, and obviously, like this group of artists, endured horrific things at the front. And so when he went off to Palestine in 1923, it was a revelation for him. I mean, he wrote about it and he said, a boy like me from the East End, I came from grey and I've seen the light. And this, he did a lot of really stunning landscape paintings, but this was done during Easter week when he was smuggled into the Arab Christian Armenian Church of St. James, and he did a huge number of sketches in that church. And I think it's a really interesting contrast to Stanley. Firstly, Stanley never did, interiors was never a great passion for him, but this very free use of paint and colour is, for me, it's almost the antithesis of Stanley's work, but I think it's a really beautiful picture. And I think, having that alongside the Gertler in the gallery is such a stunning pairing. So this is another of the highlights of the exhibition for me. Nevinson, another Slade star, but I put him into the First World War section because this obviously is relevant. It was painted in 1916. This is loading timber at Southampton docks. Obviously, Southampton was a centre of shipbuilding, and in its Victorian heyday, a huge number of luxury goods were imported there, and there was obviously the new railway link to London. So there was this sort of massive burgeoning of commercial prosperity there. And obviously during the First World War that shifted to more of a sort of wartime construction. Nevinson was a bit of a bully at the Slade and a great adversary of Stanley's. Tonks thought he was a failure, again, like Bomberg. And I think at that date, when he was at the Slade, he hadn't quite found his artistic mojo, if you like. And he went off to war. And like Stanley, he worked as a hospital orderly and then as an ambulance driver, but on the Western Front. And he saw truly, truly horrific things. He was really traumatized by what he'd seen. And I think often artistic genius can be sparked by these terrible experiences, and that's what happened to Nevinson. He suddenly went from a pretty good painter to an outstanding painter. And you can see how the 1912 Futurist exhibition influenced him. I mean, it is almost vorticist, the way the timber is constructed across the picture plane with these incredibly dynamic angles. I think it's a real tour de force, this painting. And actually, at this point, I should mention Southampton, not during the First World War, but during the Second World War, it endured quite a lot of damage. It opened in 1939, and soon after, a lot of the pictures had to be moved out, and the entrance hall was bombed, and it was requisitioned for use by local government. So it was rather sad, really, to have suddenly had this beautiful building and museum up and running, but obviously that all turned round in the end, in the 50s, when it was regenerated again. This obviously isn't in the exhibition, this is in Tate, but this is Nevinson's other masterpiece, and in a section on the Slade and World War I think you cannot not show this picture called La Mitrailleuse. And for me, this really sums up Nevinson's belief that war had become this sort of dehumanized, mechanized failure. And really, I find this incredibly powerful. And in the exhibition, we've shown Nevinson's work alongside some of Stanley's sketches. And ideally, we would have Stanley's chapel at Berkeley, which for me is the epitome of Stanley's wartime experience. And to compare Nevinson with this, Nevinson is about dehumanization, and this is about humanity, coming to terms with humanity, forgiveness and reconciliation, and coming to terms with loss and what one has seen. And so you really see how these two artists have deeply contrasting experiences of war and their artistic output thereafter. So there's another Stanley map reading, which is one of the panels at Sandham, which again shows this sort of fraternal spirit, this sense of community. And I always think there's quite a nice abstract element to some of these Sandham pictures, the way the figures are arranged in a sort of arc around the arch, but obviously Nevinson takes that a step further. So moving on to World War II, and one of the highlights of the exhibition, the raising of Jairus' daughter, and I've been dying to get this into the gallery. And at some point I'd quite like to do a resurrection exhibition, so we'll have to have it back for that. But as you all know, this was painted in 1947, and it's part of the Port Glasgow Resurrection series, and it was originally planned in 1939 as a celebration of Stanley's visit to Leonard Stanley with his friends, Daphne and George Charlton, and obviously that was quite a complicated stay. And so this is set in Leonard Stanley, but he's, it's typical Stanley because it combines a bit of Leonard Stanley, a bit of Cookham, and also a village in Gloucestershire called Stonehouse. So you can see on the left there, that church in the middle with the two roads running either side, which is still a feature of Stonehouse Village. So true to form, Stanley was working on the shipbuilding on the Clyde series, commissioned by the War Artists Commission, headed up by Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark had given him this amazing opportunity, and clearly he wants to just do his own thing a bit and paints this, which I think is amazing to see in the flesh in the gallery. And this isn't the best slide, so I do urge you all to go and look up close. So in the centre, you've got a typical Stanley experience of a religious happening, taking part in our own actuality. So this is in Leonard Stanley, and you've got Christ raising Jairus' daughter, lifting his finger up like that. And Jairus is shown clutching the bedpost. He's living, he's in deep sorrow. And according to the Bible, a lot of the people who don't believe Christ's power are turning their back and running away. And in one of the first drawings, you can see them all clustered out in front of the window. And I think he made quite a good artistic decision to remove them. We just have the very stylish little geranium pot instead. And in biblical terms, this story was linked to Christ's resurrection and also the theme of the Last Judgment. And so you have this quite peaceful meditative scene in the middle, and then either side these scenes of resurrection. So on the left, people coming up through the paving stones, which I think were inspired by San Marco. Stanley had these little grey gowns and grey art books that he took to the front. And there in the Fra Angelico book is illustrated Fra Angelico's resurrection with figures pushing themselves out of these paving stones. And for sure he had been looking at that. And there is also this sense of wartime reconciliation as well. If you think about the time when it was painted, soldiers coming home and greeting their family. And so I feel the tempo shifts on either side. It's much more excited. And so on the right, again, you've got these scenes which remind me a little bit of the Resurrection altarpiece at Sandham, where people are clasping hands. At Sandham, the soldiers are lifting each other up out from the earth, and here they are clasping each other in greeting. I'm sure you're all aware. So here's Stanley, opening the gate. There's Daphne, and here's Hilda, forever in his mind. And Hilda died just a couple of years later. So I think it's rather moving retrospectively that she should be featuring in this image of the resurrection. So Leslie Cole was an artist that was new to me. I didn't know much about him, so I had to read up a little bit about him. And he was desperate to be commissioned by Kenneth Clark. And actually, there were quite a few artists wanted these posts. And he tried and tried and tried again. And I think some of these early works of his were quite derivative. I mean, this really reminds me of bed making at Sandham. And he'd definitely been looking at Stanley's work and was hugely inspired by him. And Stanley loved sort of looking at the texture of the counterpanes on the beds. And there's definitely a similar feeling here. So this was, a commission which was all about the role of women during the Second World War, which was something that hadn't really been, a lot of women were having to step into the role in the Second World War, which they had not in the First War. And in 1943, so just after this, he did get his full-time commission from Kenneth Clark. And his merit was seen to be his dispassionate depiction of horror on the front. So he was sent off to a lot of battle scenes. And although he might not have been the most technically brilliant artist, actually the way he depicted scenes from history were. And I'm going to show you one of his most famous pictures, which is the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And this is perhaps, I think, the least harrowing of some of the pictures that he did. I didn't, I wanted to temper it slightly, but I think through his work you get a real sense of the desperation and horror. He did a lot for the, disseminating information and recording information for the war effort in that way. I just wanted to include this, which was a picture owned by Kenneth Clark, but it fitted really nicely into this section on the Second World War. Kennington was an artist we had in the Counterpoint exhibition, and I think he's one of the unsung heroes of the mod Brit art scene at that time, and I really love this picture. It's called The Heart of England, and it was painted in 1943. And it's a lovely neo-romantic, it's in the neo-romantic tradition, which Spencer nudges into a little bit, I think. And it depicts the pilot hero Richard Hilbury, who was killed that year. And it's all about a pilot's love for England and his sense of duty. And I would have loved to have included this, but it doesn't belong to Southampton, but it is definitely a Kenneth Clark picture. And he commissioned this, and I just think it's such a beautiful, beautiful image. And this was actually very important for film. The work of Powell and Pressburger, what was it called? A Matter of Life and Death, was inspired by this. And actually Kenneth Clark hung this in the National Gallery, exceptionally. I mean, there were no modern British works of art in the National Gallery, but this he hung there for 6 months. So we come on to our little portraiture section, and this fantastic picture by Gilbert, painted in 1923, Stanley's brother. Some of you may know that I've been working on a book on Gilbert Spencer with Paul Gough, and so I've come to know him better than I did. And actually looking at this, I've been working particularly on his early life and how he struggled to find his artistic language. And his early years were really spent making models, and that was his skill in life. He really preferred sort of 3D forms and was really into sculpture. And it was only much later on that he discovered he could paint in two-dimensionally. It came much later to him than Stanley. And I think this is a real masterpiece, actually. And as I'm sure you'll remember, it's hanging next to Marjorie Metz in the gallery, which was painted nearly 30 years later by Stanley. And you can see they both use the picture plane in the same way, very bravely, with the figure completely filling the canvas. But Gilbert was doing this much earlier, and I think in this instance, Stanley was definitely influenced by his brother. You will have seen in the catalogue, I love this image. I mean, they're spitting image, these two, of a real-life rat catcher. And it was a pretty miserable job. The poorest of the poor did it. You were prone to illness and very poor pay. And as such, I think this must have been painted in probably Gilbert's house. It's very middle class. You've got the lovely fireplace and the artist's accoutrements on the mantelpiece. It's all pretty well-to-do with the lovely carpet. And it is inconceivable that he would have lived in a house like this. Sorry, I can't put them the wrong way. This is a picture that got away that I would have liked to have included in the exhibition. This was by Henry Tonks, Stanley's professor at the Slade. And this is called The Torn Gown, and I think it's really rather beautiful. And this would have fitted rather nicely, I think, between Gilbert and then progressing on to Marjorie Metz. She would have been rather a nice buffer between the two. And this is quite early. This was painted in 1897. And I think it's an important picture because it shows Henry Tonks' emphasis on draftsmanship. You can see anatomically she is completely exact. Her face is beautifully drawn, and yet it is tempered with a very lively and free use of paint in the gown. And this is exactly the type of picture that Kenneth Clark loved, because it was a balance between realism and a free use of paint. But sadly, it was impossible for us to borrow this. There's Marjorie being painted. So this is another picture that we didn't include in the show that was from Southampton. Good old Patricia or not, as the case may be. But we had her a couple of years ago for, and I thought, you know, it was post-COVID, and we had her for, gosh, quite a long time, that exhibition in the end. So we decided to leave her out. But obviously she is an important part of the Southampton City collection and their collection of Spencers. She was acquired by the Smith bequest, the second guy, and I just wanted to, I found this quite an interesting picture because this was done in 1933, and it really is sort of at the beginning of Spencer's infatuation by Stanley. And I just want, I mean, this is going off-piste a bit, but I wanted you to think about the comparison between this in 1933 and how 2 years later he gets to the Ferrens picture, and how their relationship has changed in 2 years. And also how this was acquired much, much later by Ferrens. And there was this real distaste for nudity in the early part of the century, and maybe still now, given this picture is not the most easy on the eye. But it just shows how collecting tastes have changed over the decades. So this is another important picture that, again, we were not able to borrow, by Henry Lamb, who was Stanley's great mentor. And this is Edie McNeill, painted in 1911 in Brittany, where there was this wonderful artist colony. And I think David Boyd Haycock showed this picture in his lecture. She was the sister of Dorelia, who was Augustus John's second wife, lover, and then second wife. So she was she modelled for all of these artists. And Henry Lamb was such a huge and important influence on Stanley in many ways, not only artistically, but also as a mentor, helping him navigate the ways of the art world and how to position himself in the art market. And so it would have been quite nice to have had a Henry Lamb, but it was just going to be too expensive. So, so this is another favourite of mine. This is by William Nicholson. And he streets away from Stanley in many ways in terms of the use of paint. But I wanted to include it because it was painted in 1936, the same year as View from Cookham Bridge, which we have hung next to it in the exhibition. And nothing could prepare me actually for the beauty of this picture when it arrived. I'd seen it many years ago, but it is absolutely stunning. And this is a real Kenneth Clark picture. This is the epitome of his taste, because it balances the natural world with a free use of paint and yet this sort of rather exact, I mean, you can still tell what it is. So Nicholson, I just wanted to compare also, just show you a little bit about the progression of Nicholson's art. So this is a really early painting of his when he lived on the South Downs, and he did these beautiful sort of striations of colour, not particularly mixed paint. This is in Brighton, this picture. So this was very typical of his work, as was these stunning, this slide does not do it justice, these beautiful, beautiful still life works, often of light reflecting on metal. And this is in the National Galleries of Scotland. And for me, this later painting is the synthesis of those two things. You know, it's that there is an element of, you know, modelling of paint, but also this sort of sparkling of colour. And this was inspired by his temporary move to Andalusia in the 1930s. He'd lost his wife and his son. He moved away from the Downs, Rottingdean, where he lived, and you know, he had this blissful family life. And he was completely absorbed by the beauty and light of Andalusia. He met another woman, and for me, this really encapsulates the change in his life and the merging of his two artistic disciplines into something that was very new. And Kenneth Clark saw this at the Leicester Galleries and snapped it up without consulting anyone, because it fell under his £300 budget where he had to ask other people. And I think this really is one of the highlights of another highlight of the exhibition. And Kenneth Clark he called Nicholson an essayist because his pictures aren't really about huge much. They're sort of meditations more than subject pictures. And here we've got lovely view from Cookham Bridge, which was painted in the same year. And for me, this is a wonderful contrast. You know, Stanley's very realist, beautiful approach to painting landscape. And you know, in my last talk, when I spoke about the landscape paintings, Delight in Nature, and we talked about that very pre-Raphaelite approach, painting leaf by leaf, blade by blade in that Victorian tradition. And for me, that very much encapsulates that. And it sums up, you know, his love for Cookham and the church and religion and this very sort of sacred movement of the river through the village. And it's a wonderful evocation of the village and faith. I just wanted to end on this artist called Paul Delvaux. He's a Belgian surrealist, and this is in Southampton City Art Gallery. And I really wanted to borrow this because I wanted to hang it alongside Sarah Tubb because have a little religious section. So here is Sarah Tubb having her religious experience. And this is Paul Delvaux's Belgian surrealist religious experience. This was painted in 1949, so 10 years after, roughly, Sarah Tubb. And it's called The Annunciation, and obviously it's not a literal annunciation in the same way that Sarah Tubb is not a literal religious event. But it's really about the sort of arrival of spring and more of a pagan annunciation. And I think I think it's really interesting to have a worldview. It's very easy to be inward looking and just look at Stanley and Cookham. But it's very interesting to set him in a global context, which I don't think people do often enough. And he more than stands up to these European surrealists, and you know, he should be on that global stage. But sadly, we couldn't sit him alongside this picture, which I think he would have quite enjoyed. Anyway, thank you. And I am so appreciative of you all waiting to listen to my little talk. So thank you.